when I give advice to founders, it's, you've got to be really passionate about this, right? Like you've got to like find a problem you're passionate about and then figure out what solutions are, required to help you get there and get a competitive
Mhm.
advantage. And so if blockchain is not one of those, then obviously don't use it, right? If AI is not one of those, don't use it, right? Like,
Mhm.
so but I think there's a lot of ways these days to apply these technologies and get a competitive advantage. That's the big thing that we're looking for when we look at those real world applications. It's, does this technology give you a major competitive advantage versus the market?
Welcome to the Founders Journey podcast. Inspiration, education for founders by founders. Welcome back to the Founders Journey podcast. Greg Moran, one of the hosts here, along with my co-host Peter Dean. Good to see you back, Peter.
Thanks for having me back.
It's always a surprise. And here today, actually with our guest, I'll do a quick intro, but Aly Madhavji, who we are thrilled to have with us today. Aly, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
So just a real quick intro of Aly here. He is the managing partner at Blockchain Founders Fund, based out of Singapore. And Blockchain Founders Fund really focuses on investing in and really building top tier startups around blockchain intersectional technologies like that with AI and things. He's also, and we're going to get into that. So if you don't know what any of that means, we'll talk about that because that's kind of the topic today. Aly also consults with organizations on emerging technologies like INSEAD and the UN. Because I think one of the things we're going to talk about around alleviation of poverty, and that's another area that these technologies are, they're not only good business, but I think there's also a lot of societal good that comes from. So he's an internationally acclaimed author, multiple books, serves as a board member of a few publicly traded companies. So all around, super qualified to be talking about emerging technologies, blockchain, Web3, things like that. So Aly, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks so much for having me here, and excited to share and also learn from the two of you.
Yeah, no, we're I don't know how much we're going to be able to teach you about this stuff, but we're certainly glad to have you. So let's start out just really high level. Talk about your background and Blockchain Founders Fund, how you got into this. How you got into this entire space.
It's a really good question, and for me, it stems from, I would say, even the way that I was brought up and the environment and the circumstances, right? And so when I think about blockchain technology and really what's happening here is it's about really leveling the playing field. It's about increasing and allowing for transparency and more fair opportunities essentially across the board. And, when you put that in the context of, why I gravitated to this space so fast, I look back and I see the environment that I grew up in. I mean, both of my parents are refugees from East Africa moving to Canada. And I think that environment, created a lot of uncertain circumstances and a lot of, unfortunate events, but that led to, I would say, a fortunate situation, circumstances. And then you put that with the earlier things that I did, and you mentioned some of them in my bio around, the books and, having served on the board of governors of the University of Toronto as well, which is a multi-billion-dollar institution, published 3 books in the education space. And a big part of that was, how do we help level the playing field for everyone? And I think education in a similar way is a great equalizer of opportunity. And, that really led to, at the end of the day, once I came across Bitcoin and blockchain technology, even though it was, in a fairly early form to what we see today, it really triggered this ability to really like level the playing field and actually solve a lot of these global challenges around circumstances that just aren't fair and not equal opportunity. And so fast forward, did a startup in this space in 16, 17. Once we exited that, we started Blockchain Founders Fund in 2017. We now have 110 portfolio companies in the space. We've invested literally all across the spectrum in this area, and this technology even beyond some of the areas where I mentioned around like leveling the playing field, solving multi-party trust issues across organizations. But it's even further than that. And I think in a lot of cases, the hype sort of masks what's really going on. So take, over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of hype around NFTs, and people think that these
Mhm.
are JPEGs and monkey images, and it's further from, right? I think the big innovation here that everyone's missing, that's even it's so apparent, but it's just missing, is that this is the first technology in human history that essentially allows us to have ownership of the digital world. And if you
Right.
think about how core ownership is in the physical world, right? I mean, our societies are based on ownership of things. And so, what makes us think that that's not required in the digital world when we're moving more and more in that direction? I take it 30, 40 years ago, none of us were spending time in the digital world, right? Maybe it was 0% or 5%. Now, if you ask a Gen Z, you're going to see 50, 60, 70% time in the digital world, right? And that's only going to continue. So these things are actually so critical to, I would say, everything that we do, unlocking value in like the future of human society in so many ways, of being able to transfer value digitally, being able to own things digitally, that this is actually the core. And I think we're going to start to see that over this next few years where it's going to become more and more apparent.
It's so interesting. It's funny. I sat yesterday, and until you just explained it the way you did, right? I wasn't making this connection because again, I've sort of lived in the enterprise SaaS world. Every business I've started has been around that. So the whole concept of blockchain Web3 is still fairly new to me. And I sat with a founder yesterday. I was in New York yesterday, and he's starting and his business is basically it's art curation, digital art curation, right? And he was explaining the same concept to me around this digital ownership. The problem is you have so many in this use case, right? This is around works of art. It's just out there, and the ability to basically trace it back to the actual creator itself, right? To the creator of that work, um, has historically just been nearly impossible, right? But that ability then to connect that creator with the end consumer of that art, you know, it makes sense when you start to think about that, right? Because I produce, a lot of written content, other people produce a lot of digital content. You stick it out there, but that's it. It could go anywhere. This is actually connecting those dots. Am I sort of explaining that right? I mean, that was the use case I sort of stumbled across yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at this, even from an art perspective, and you start having the creation of all of these things around like stable diffusion, and you see all these different forms of art that are only really at the start, really at the sort of the cusp of what's happening in this technology. I mean,
Right.
all of this needs to be tracked, even in terms of a blockchain. When you think about auditability of AI, even right, like this is
Yep.
still in its very early stages, but as you see regulation come up more, which it will, it's in discussion now, all of these things are going to need to be auditable, and understanding what's going into this black box and what's coming out is going
Uh,
to need to be pretty clear. And all of this is going to end up having to happen on some sort of
The track.
blockchain.
Yep. Yeah. It's really amazing.
yeah, no, that it totally makes sense. Back to your now, you've funded a lot of companies in the space. What does that landscape look like now? I know you're talking about like emerging AI with some of this technology, but have you seen the funding for this change? I know AI. We talked to Carter recently, and they say that's obviously a big place. A lot of funding's going. I know you had a time when there was a lot of funding going towards this technology. How are you seeing that evolve in what your guys are doing?
It's a good question, right? So when we look at about investing, we're investing in Web3 and blockchain as a whole, but
Yep.
we really look at major innovations coming at the cusp of technologies and intersections of technology. When you bring together AI and blockchain, when you bring together like IoT and blockchain, you can start unlocking real exponential growth from timing of these technologies where they're at right now. So when we look at, what's happening sort of from a broader landscape, there was a lot of funding, you're right, into 21,
Mhm.
22, 23 have been, relatively slow years, I'd say, and you've seen a really big pullback until probably last couple months. And I'll sort of explain what we've seen more broadly. It's not just blockchain, it's actually I would say the macro venture landscape. And so once you saw public market valuations get cuts. We talked about SaaS a little bit earlier. You saw public company multiples on SaaS, go from forward revenues of 30x, 35x down to 5x, 7x, 10x, right? And we're probably closer to 10x even right now in certain cases, right? Obviously there's a range, but when you saw that decline, what you actually saw was Series ABC funds decline in terms of their funding, right? Because they looked at their exit multiples and they looked at what public company multiples were, and they said, we can't be backing companies at these valuations. And they started pulling back. They had obviously a hole in their, on their balance sheet, let's call it, or when they look at what their current investments have been because of the pretty steep, pullback, 70, 80% in terms of a lot of these valuations. So what that actually meant was a lot of these Series A, B, C funds couldn't actually stop investing, right? Because they have obligations to their LPs. It's very difficult for them to go back to LP and say, hey, we're not investing at all anymore. So what they actually did is they actually became seed investors or pre-seed investors in some cases. And so what was interesting over the last year and a half, you saw a decline in valuations pretty much against every category except for AI. And you saw then you saw an increase in valuations though at seed stage and pre-seed, which was very odd because you're taking a large amount of money, you're trying to deploy in a much smaller category. So we then looked at this and we tend to typically our checks are in pre-seed and seed, and then we follow on in Series A. And we looked at this and we said this gets very difficult to back because you've got increasing valuations on seed and you've got significantly decreased valuations, 70, 80% on exit multiples, et cetera. So that as a whole, we weren't the only ones seeing that. Basically across the board, most people saw that from the VC landscape. And so you saw a pretty large, decline or slowdown funding. And valuation higher on seed stage, there wasn't a lot of deals happening. And what we probably saw about 90 days ago, maybe 100 days ago now, our data, we started to see this pick up because we saw now a pretty large correction in seed valuations, lower, but that's actually good for everyone because we're seeing actually an increased activity. And so if more deals are closing and more companies are getting funded, it is a lot better for everyone. So we saw companies get better, of course, better numbers, better metrics. A lot of companies obviously washed out of this process over the last year and a half, but we're actually seeing a lot more deals happen. And even from our perspective, we're now doing more deals last month and this month than we've done in any month in our fund's history. We think that will continue for at least the next few months. And obviously we'll continue to reassess that. But we love what we're seeing in the market now. And we tend to typically look at 400 to 600 a month.
Yeah, that it's completely consistent with what I see in our fund as well. I mean, we essentially slowed down to almost a stop, for 12 months in terms of funding because we're at the same stage you are. We're seed, that's I guess pre-seed and seed would be the way, and we've seen the exact same thing the last few months. It's been this quick uptake as we've just kind of had to wait for those seed valuations to start to come down. And I mean, that's a big lag. It's super. I think that that's held true even in enterprise SaaS or anything. And it's interesting that it would, within blockchain Web3, it's been the exact same thing with the exception of AI, right?
I mean, I think one of the big things is in environments where there's high interest rates and like a high risk-free rate, right? It is very difficult to invest in venture or private equity. Right? So you're seeing less investors deploy money into these categories from like a LP perspective. We had quite good timing because we raised our fund, and closed it last year. You're seeing that, and I think as there's expectations that interest rates will get cut in 24 or mid 24 or depending on who you're talking to, we're seeing increased activity in this front.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting. I've also seen you do a lot of work with private equity firms, and we've seen them creep down in size and deals that they never really touched before. And you kind of made that point. And I'm seeing that kind of across the ecosystem because that's a good place to deploy now, really.
Right. Absolutely. So when you look out kind of on the landscape, Aly, when you think about the future of blockchain in general, if you're a founder interested in getting into this space, right? What should you be looking at? What should you be thinking about today in terms of where you see this, where you see the technology emerge, and where the opportunities for founders are gonna really emerge?
It's a really good question. I mean, look at this technology, going and impacting a lot of different sectors, right? So when we invest in companies, we sort of break it down into, three categories essentially when we're thinking about investing in startups in space. There's essentially your, companies that are servicing the space, which could be like, a little bit more web 2.0 kind of company, but they're like on off ramps. It could be like exchanges. They're more centralized though. They're not
Yep.
decentralized. Got your more Web3 native companies, which are going to be your decentralized protocols, like fully decentralized applications or DeFi, etc. But then we've also got a category which is real applications of, right? And there's a lot of really cool examples in here, which are, when you have the technology impacting the everyday life of people and they don't even know they're using it, right? And I've got some
Right.
pretty cool examples of that as well. But I think at the end of the day, when I give advice to founders, it's, you've got to be really passionate about this, right? Like you've got to like find a problem you're passionate about and then figure out what solutions are, required to help you get there and get a competitive
Mhm.
advantage. And so if blockchain is not one of those, then obviously don't use it, right? If AI is not one of those, don't use it, right? Like,
Mhm.
so but I think there's a lot of ways these days to apply these technologies and get a competitive advantage. That's the big thing that we're looking for when we look at those real world applications. It's, does this technology give you a major competitive advantage versus the market? And if that's true, then that becomes very interesting for us as an investment, right? Um, so, I would say you've got to be passionate about it. You've got to really go talk to customers. I mean, if you're starting off a business, we generally recommend our startups talk to at least 30 potential customers, figure out what they want, figure out their pain points, really go see like, is there real problem here that you're solving? And can you get to a stage where you can solve this effectively and monetize it, right?
Yep. It can you you just referenced something. I'd love you to go back to it for a second. Those use cases, those examples of the use cases that where this technology is happening in our everyday lives, and we don't even realize this is what we're dealing with, right? Because I think a lot of there's sort of this kind of magic, right, associated with like blockchain and Web3, but it's around us every day. What are those examples?
I'll give you a few different examples, right? So take gaming, for example, right? And you know, when a lot of people look at this market, they think about these AAA games, very high detailed, et cetera, but they might not realize that, 65% of the entire industry's revenues are hyper casual. And so we've actually got this superstar female founder out of DC working on a company called Breshna. And Breshna essentially allows anyone in the world to create a video game in minutes, these hyper casual games in minutes. And what's really cool here is she's also now built the world's first text to game engine. So you can just type what you want and I'll build you the game, which is really, really cool.
Huh.
And these are things like, Super Mario, Flappy Bird, Space Invaders, Wordle, but like these are the templates. And so as they get more and more of these templates and they're opening these up so anyone can build templates in, then anyone can just build a game in seconds. And so, we backed Fresh a year and a half ago. They hadn't been creating games really yet. You know, this year alone, they've created about 150,000 games already. So it's just blown up. There's millions of users playing these games every month. And what's really cool here is as part of this layer on the blockchain, there's now incentives for people that create the game templates, right? People that actually create the games, people that own the assets or think about royalties, like assets or etc. You earn royalties from that. Anyone that helps to promote and share these also earn. So you have these really cool things, but it's a very different take on gaming. Some people think about let's create one killer game, about how do we create billions, right?
Right.
And even if a small fraction of those actually become popular and win, it already amounts to a lot more in aggregate, right? And now we're seeing teams actually use this technology because they're saying this is the first time we've ever been able to monetize our work and create things that are fun for students, but actually be able to share it even more broadly than just our own classroom. So there's a lot of really cool things that we're unlocking opportunities here. Another cool one that I think impacts any pet owners, if there's any listeners here that are pet owners, and I'm not a pet owner myself, so I've learned a lot about this market. But at least what I learned about this, and many of our discoverers are pet owners, is if you've got a dog, a cat, or a pet, and you typically have their vaccine certificates, and these certificates are typically on paper. In some rare
Right.
cases, they're actually digital, but they're kind of more centralized, more like localized systems, so they don't actually get accepted everywhere. But every time you go to like a dog daycare, a pet daycare, every time you go to a groomer, you've got to actually bring these certificates with you. And this seems like such an archaic process. And so,
That's right.
yeah. And so Patastic, one of our investments, is digitized this and created almost like a pet passport or pet ID. And this is actually easier to do than, say, health records or human IDs because of you don't have to follow, say, HIPAA compliance for pets. As an example, it's a lot less regulated, a lot easier to actually execute, scale, less red tape. This actually has been really cool. So we put over 500,000 pets on chain in the last few months. Nestle came in as an investor in the company as well, which is one of the biggest food makers in the world. But like really, really fascinating things where this is going to change the entire industry. In reality, this should be gold standard across the entire world of how it operates, because nobody should have to get around these certificates with them when need to get support for their pet. So really, really cool things that we might not be thinking about, but at the end of the day, it's powered in the background by this technology that's allowing more effective, better sort of experiences.
Yep. I'm curious if this is just kind of a quick aside question, but my fund is, we are typically enterprise SaaS, but we're exclusively around future of work technologies. It seems like the blockchain has huge implications when you're talking about kind of future of work sort of topics, right? Recruiting, hire, just sort of the ability to kind of move your own data from um, one employer to another, things like that. Are you seeing that as also a kind of an area of emergence around the startups you're looking at?
We are seeing this as a very interesting area. I think maybe as part of that, maybe a bigger, broader part of that is, cookies are getting phased out starting
Right.
2024. And this is impacting a lot more, like this is essentially impacting everyone, right? Every major business you can even think of, that based off of advertising revenues is essentially based off cookies. And
Right.
we're seeing really interesting opportunities here when you talk about the data and being able to own data, be able to potentially aggregate data more effectively and have it go to certain parties that could use that data. I think that this technology will be required. The world could move in a very different way, but I think Europe, the way they've sort of a lot of national lines with data is people's right, and they own their own data, and I think that aligns fairly well with ethos and the way that a lot of people in the Web3 space have been thinking. So if the world moves more to that European standard, which it seems like it has been to some extent, then I think there's a very strong use case for this technology, and it would win in that scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's cool. I just want to take it in a different direction. You talked about kind of leveling the playing field, and really interested. It seems like you're really passionate about that. So I know you're doing work with INSEAD and the UN to kind of look at using emerging technologies to alleviate poverty, and for other things other than just generating revenue or kind of solving that problem. What are some of the things that you've seen tangible impacts or things that you're hoping to see?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I look at it is to have sustainable impact, it has to be a social. So it has to go with revenue, it has to make profits, but you can
Yeah.
still do incredible good in the world, right? And my biggest frustration oftentimes is we built a system that just leaves a lot of people out. And
Yeah.
it's built as part of the system, and we seem to be okay with it. But when we look at it, we've left 1 billion people out of the financial system that are unbanked, that don't have access to entities, and these are major problems. When you think about this technology, we have the fundamental ability to solve borrowing and savings problems in a digital world, being able to also even leverage like peer-to-peer solutions that can actually solve this quite effectively. We're not there fully yet. But when you think of even like any wallet instantly you can create without an identity, you already are solving potentially that like savings or like, checking, account problem. Then like savings is being yield off of it. Right? And then like lending and borrowing are obviously very critical parts of society's work and how you can unlock growth. And so we need to be able to, make major progress on these. But regulation comes into play, and we've got to figure out what's the balance, right? Because I don't think it's okay that our existing system cuts out a bit of people. Having said that, there's reasons for some of these things, right? Obviously, you need to be conscious of like AML and CFT and making sure money's not in the wrong places, used for the wrong purposes, etc. So there are reasons for some of these rules and regulations, but we've got to figure out where's that balance. How do we make this work? So there's a lot of really, really cool applications right now that are happening across, Latin America, Central America, take Sub-Saharan Africa, where this technology is making a real difference. Even when you think about, and this is not a problem that we think about oftentimes West or more developed, countries. When you take problems of like instability of currencies, you have, an inability to trust either your banks or your central bank. Like these are problems that our countries. Take Nigeria as an example, and how big of a there is in the, in the central bank rate to the black market rate, even of the naira, right? So these are very big problems that we might not think of every day or even ever in our part of the world. But oftentimes this is what they're doing every single. And so, being able to create and access financial systems more effectively, being able to create an alternative credit system because their governments, may not be effective or doing the things that we would expect here in America or Canada or other countries are things that we need to solve. And so we've got all sorts of companies. We just did a couple new investments in Sub-Saharan Africa. We're doing one right now in Central America and Latin America. How do you move money effectively? How do you actually do cross-border payments, actually bring money effectively, reduce fees dramatically, solve challenges around credit? We just backed a company in Nigeria called which essentially has built a couple of really cool things. But one, they built the ability for microfinance banks and banks to be able to issue loans more effectively. And they've helped drop non-performing loan ratios for these microfinance banks and banks from 30% to 10%, which is incredible. And they also built what's like a plaid for Africa. So you can essentially connect in your bank, share all of your transactions, which gives a lot more detail for a lender. It also allows you to access credit more effectively now, right? And that might not be something you're doing every day in America because you've got a more effective credit scoring system. But in other parts of the world, it's not as effective. But even, the time to update the credit score, credit bureau in some of these countries take, in this case specifically, it can take up to 1 month, 1.5 months. Credits help reduce that to 17 seconds. So like a lot of really, really cool changing that I think are going to even help some of these countries leapfrog potentially the systems we have here, because a lot of our systems are then going to be, 20, 30, 40 years, and they're going to be innovating to what's, at the cutting edge.
I was going to say, I mean, the entire credit reporting system in the US, you could argue is pretty archaic, right? I mean, those lag times are not uncommon here in the US as well, right? When you see, I mean, it's not uncommon for months to go by.
Yeah, and I love the idea and what you said. It's super important. It's not just about helping; it's like enabling, and from a profit standpoint, because that's sustainable, right? That's a sustainable advantage that you just kind of intimated that it could be an advantage because they're skipping a step. They're not doing the old thing we're doing. And I saw that the first time I was in Singapore many years ago. Cell phones were every kid had them. In the US, it was kind of scarce, and this is aging me, but every kid had them. And I'm like, what is going on? Why does everyone have a cell phone? It was just like people in business had a cell phone, but that was the infrastructure they skipped to, right? And then it was just mobile was so much easier for them.
Peter, was it cell phones or telephones that were
not that old? Cell phone. But
yeah, no, I
love that. That's so cool that, and those are some of the things that you're seeing happen. And those are things that you're investing in too, it sounds like.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at some of the biggest problems that you see in the emerging world, it's oftentimes going to be around like inability to access credit and
Yeah.
lending, and that becomes a very big bottleneck because we might not think about it because it's so, native now to our everyday life, but
Uh,
it impacts every part of it, right? Whether it's like credit cards or even like
Yeah.
other financing options when you're buying a car or a house, like all these things are almost like expected.
Yeah.
Whereas in these parts of the world, they just may not even exist, or you
Yeah.
can't access them at effective rates that would make any sense. And now
Right.
it's starting to happen. You start adding in technology. Ideally, we can get more international financing that, makes, if we can reduce the risk, it allows, opportunities for investors globally to earn a high yield, but not take on, excessive risk, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. That's really cool.
Well, this is really amazing, Ali. I think super interesting. I think just to kind of as we start to wrap up, tell us a little bit about what are you working on today. I know you're a writer, you've got a lot of stuff going on outside of the fund. Tell us what you're working on today, and if somebody has, if there's a founder out there who has a concept that they would love to kind of beat up with you a little bit, what's the best way for somebody to get into contact?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I love what I do, right? And I think that, for me, the big thing is I see myself as an investor than as a founder, right? And we love to roll up our sleeves with our founders, help them solve problems. We want to be the first place any founder comes when they have a challenge, not be worried about getting scolded, but more around like, let's just figure it out, right? Let's figure it out
Yep.
before, let's figure out how to solve it. And the big part of this is we'll also help connect them into who are some of the best in the world around domains, right? So this is a big thing for us in the way I look at it. And our founders, can call me anytime, middle of the night, et cetera. And I love it. And it's like,
Mhm.
let's go solve problems together. And that's a big part of sort of how I see things. And so, if you do have a great idea, if you're trying to build something that, can change the world or sort of, help a lot of people, definitely reach out to us. You can find any of our partners and our team on social media across any of the major ones. You can also just reach out on our website and share with us what you're working on. Actually, really cool is we review every single thing that gets submitted to us as a partner group, not an analyst. Like we review every single company. And I think this is actually very important when you're looking at emerging technologies and how the future could be fine. Like we believe that like a partner has got to look at this, spend the time, bring in wealth of experiences. And it's the same thing that, when we're working with experienced founders, we want them to bring our A game. We do the same, right? So
Yep.
would love to hear from anyone that's working on some cool ideas.
It's awesome.
That's
Website is what?
Blockchainfest.com.
Got it. And we'll put that in the show notes as well. Ollie, really a real pleasure to have you. This has been really, this is just incredibly interesting stuff. I think, it's not, there's so much talk around emerging technologies and, whether that's blockchain or it's Web3 or it's AI and things like that to try to sort of simplify it a little bit, make sense, and really try to help founders really identify where those opportunities
just for the founders listening out there. He just described what good money is. Like
right.
a company that's going to do that. That is a good description. If you're new at this is what you want to hear from your investors. Someone that says exactly what Ali said.
Yep.
Roll up the sleeves, look at stuff, be part of your team, add significant value. So really excited to have you in the ecosystem.
Yep. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ali. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you. My pleasure. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah. See you on the next edition of the Founders Journey podcast.